coming up to 20 to 9, when Susan Boyle stepped onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent a few years ago and performed I Dreamed a Dream, she stunned a rather cynical crowd and judging panel. But the Scottish singer now, of course, has moved on to sell millions of albums worldwide.
Her success follows difficult times earlier in her life. She was bullied at school and spent years believing that she'd suffered minor brain damage at birth. She has now been diagnosed, though, with Asperger Syndrome. But how common is such a late diagnosis? We can speak to Povey, who's a director of the National Autistic Society. Morning to you. Thanks very much for joining us. I've already seen people telling me on Twitter, for example, that this is not uncommon to get a late diagnosis. How much do you see it?
Morning. Still, we have better facilities for diagnosis of children, but more and more we are seeing adults who are struggling to get a diagnosis, but often when they do get that diagnosis, they find it an enormous relief. It makes sense of all the difficulties that they've experienced throughout their lives.
And that's exactly what she said. I'm just looking at one of the interviews she's given. She's saying she's relieved, a bit more relaxed about herself. So it can have quite an impact, actually being told what might be wrong.
That's right, yes.
What about, is there enough being done to help other people who are, for example, in that position?
There's still a real need for support for adults who do get that diagnosis later. Very often they're not in any sort of system of support. Only 15% of adults with autism are in any sort of full-time employment, where very often they need quite minimal adjustments in the workplace or anything. So we do have a lot of people who aren't getting the support they need, who could contribute in a really positive way to society, but aren't able to do so at the moment.
What kind of simple adjustments are you talking about?
Very often it's things like adjustments to interview schedules, more structure, and really people understanding about autism and Asperger syndrome. The thing that most people with autistic spectrum disorders ask for is people actually understanding the condition. That's what makes the most difference in their lives.
OK. And how does it affect, particularly what we're talking about today is Asperger's, isn't it? So how does it affect people? Does it manifest itself?
Yeah, Asperger syndrome is a part of the autistic spectrum, and people with Asperger syndrome often struggle to make sense of the world around them. They have difficulties in the way that they process information, and particular difficulties in relating to other people. So those difficulties that people experience often result in them having very high levels of stress and anxiety, which impacts on their lives in quite a profound way.
And from what you've seen as well, does it affect women differently to men, for example, and girls differently to boys?
It does. Girls and women present very differently from boys. They are often better at masking the characteristics of autism, and their particular interests are often far more similar to other girls and women, so things like animals and people, but it's about the quality and quantity of those particular interests. So often girls, and particularly adult women, they're very apt to get incorrect diagnoses earlier in their lives. Depression, anxiety, perhaps self-harm or something. But in fact, it may just be that their Asperger syndrome hasn't been recognised as the key difficulty that they're experiencing.
OK, and so for people who are concerned out there either about themselves or perhaps parents, what's your first port of call?
The first port of call really should be the National Autistic Society helpline. They can contact us and we can put them in touch with local support for them.
OK, thank you very much for talking to us here this morning. Thank you.